I'm a printmaker. I studied here in Melbourne at the Victorian College of the Arts and also in Glasgow, at Glasgow School of Art. Graduated in 2000 and have been working pretty much full-time as an artist since then.
How do you describe your sort of works as well? Because they certainly all have a very similar kind of tone, I suppose, don't they?
Yeah, so printmaking has certain limits and ranges in terms of how you make the work and what you can produce. So that does tend to bring everything within a field, and I also try to do that intentionally so that the show hangs together coherently. So even though the places and the objects can be different, it doesn't jar when you move geographically from Cairo to Istanbul to New York. I want it to be consistent within that.
Now the subjects as well. Talk to us a bit about, I guess, what you choose and why.
So I've been interested in architecture for a long time, and a lot of my early prints were architecturally based, and at the time I was making those early prints, I'd been travelling in North Africa. So it's mud brick architecture, very vernacular architecture, quite heavy, simple architecture, but also very beautiful. And also the environment was dry because it's North Africa, the desert, so there wasn't much vegetation. So that kind of look dominated my work for a couple of years. And then gradually I became aware of how, even though we construct cities, there's a lot of nature in them. So we have roadside plantings, we have trees, we have parks. And I started thinking about how they intrude into our cities and our cities intrude into nature. So at first I didn't know actually how to draw trees, so I just leave blank places in the image where the plant life was. And then in 2016 my partner Kim and I went to France, which is incredibly lush. It was midsummer, everything was green, the trees were growing, and I started really thinking about how to draw trees, how to capture realistic representational colour, and then how to bring that back into the print. So it was a gradual kind of shift from the starkness of desert North Africa through to a much more lush, lifelike environment.
How would you describe the style, though, or the way you depict these things? Because, I mean, you're right, the colour certainly is very accurate, but I guess, it's not photorealism that you're aiming for here in any way, is it?
No, not at all. And in fact, I totally reject the use of any photography in my work. So any image you see here, I've gone to the place and I've sat and drawn for 1 or 3 or 5 hours. That's very important to me. Photography is so prevalent in our world. We have photos, we have Google, we have images all around us, and that's a kind of mediated response. I want to go and look at the actual thing and have an actual reaction to what's in front of me, and then present my mediation on that. But to me it's from a primary source rather than how someone else has seen a place. The other thing is that when you draw you can edit, so you can take out power poles, you can take out cars, you can take out scaffolding if there's a bit of scaffolding around a building. I did there's drawings of and prints of Cairo in this show, and friends who are in Cairo are like, that's not Cairo because there's no rubbish on the rooftops. And I took all those details, I took all that stuff out to make a simpler image. And you've got that control with the drawing which you don't have with the photograph.
So what are you aiming for then with your images? Do you want it to be like almost like a dreamlike sort of version perhaps of what you're seeing? Or
there is something of that. There's also, because I can control what goes in the image, it can look like it's from the past. If you look at old photographs of cities, there's that stillness, and particularly photographs from the 19th century when they had very long exposure times. If you look at, say, a photograph of Paris from the 19th century, you think, when was the zombie apocalypse? There's no one around, there's no cars, there's no horses, there's nothing. And it was simply that it was in a half-hour exposure, all those details got edited out by the process of the photography. There's actually a contemporary photographer now who's done this amazing series called Empty Los Angeles, and he uses a very complicated computer algorithm, and he takes thousands of photos, and the computer edits out all the noise, which is the contrails of the aircraft, the people, the litter blowing in the street, and you end up with these empty freeways. So I can do the same thing, by drawing.
I was interested as well in your bio. It mentions some of your previous work as amongst other things, I think a court illustrator, which I think must be a fascinating job. But I don't know, just tell us a bit about that sort of work and maybe how that's played into what you do now as well.
Yeah, so when I graduated from university, I thought, okay, I've got this degree, I can draw, how can I be useful? Because often you step out of university and you're like, well, what do I do next? And I thought of 3 places in the world where drawing is still useful in a kind of concrete sense. So that's courtroom illustration, because you can't take a camera into court, archaeological illustration, because photography gets distracted by the surface noise of an old object, whereas a drawing can penetrate that and give you the structure and the form. And the other one was scientific illustration, because at that stage the cameras weren't good enough to capture the details on small, very small microscopic objects. So I actually did archaeological illustration, courtroom illustration and scientific illustration in those early days after college, just to try and find ways where drawing was still functional. And the rigour of those drawings has continued to inform what I do. I don't do them anymore in the proper sense, but it was about close observation, looking, taking a lot of time to work on something and reporting accurately.
Courtroom illustration is interesting as well, though, because quite often, and I'm sure you're not one of these people, but quite often you see those illustrations and you think, that doesn't really look like a person. Well, it looks like the artist has really sort of, had a really an artistic take perhaps on who it is that they're illustrating. But I don't know, what are you told, or what are you expected? What's expected of you when you're in that role?
Well, there's a lot of problems, because you might get the person, they walk in with their hands covering their face, and they're in the dock for 30 seconds, and then they're out of there, and you need to produce a drawing, and you're back 5 or 10 metres. So it's very difficult actually to make a lifelike rendering in that time. Often you're not told, you're just sitting in the court waiting, and then the reporter who's sitting next to you will nudge you and say, this person, the next person. With a really high profile case, you might have weeks, a murder case or something, to draw and hone the likeness. But very often I'd be in there and they'd be like, okay, you've got this person's coming in, and then they're gone in 25 seconds. So
you can say to them, oh no, can you just sit still for me, or turn this way, or smile, or whatever.
Excuse me, Your Honour, can we hold that pose? No, it doesn't work.